The mud of Normandy clung like wet ash to everything it touched. Boots, rifle stocks, the frayed edges of greatcoats stiffened by salt and sweat. It was just after 04:30 on June 12, 1944, 4 days after D-Day, and the air still reeked of cordite, diesel, and something deeper, more organic, the iron-sweet stench of blood seeping into chalky French soil. Near the hamlet of Sainte-Mère-Église, in a shallow drainage ditch slick with rain and runoff, Private Ellis, Tommy Croft, crouched behind the shattered chassis of a Bren gun carrier, his fingers numb around the stock of a Winchester Model 12 trench gun. The weapon felt absurdly light in his hands, more like a tool than a weapon, its smooth-bore barrel gleaming dully under the bruised pre-dawn sky. Around him, the remnants of the 82nd Airborne's 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment huddled in silence, listening to the distant growl of Panzer IVs moving east along the Cherbourg Road. Tommy wasn't a soldier by trade. Before the war, he'd spent his days walking furrows on his family's 160-acre barley farm near Wymondham, Norfolk, mending fences, carving heifers, and loading double-aught buckshot into his grandfather's old shotgun to scare off foxes that prowled the chicken coops at night. He'd never fired at a man until Omaha Beach, and even then, it had been at shadows in smoke, shapes moving through the surf. But here, in this ditch, with German armor less than a kilometer away and no anti-tank rifles left in the company, his shotgun, his farmer's weapon, was all he had. And yet, as the first streaks of light bled over the hedgerows, Tommy noticed something the others hadn't. Not the sound of treads on gravel, nor the diesel cough of the approaching Panthers, but the way the lid tank's side skirt, a thin sheet of bolted steel, meant to deflect magnetic mines flexed slightly as it rolled over a sunken cartwheel. It wasn't armor, it was sheet metal, and it vibrated. He'd seen that vibration before. Back home, when he'd tested his new idea on the rusted door of the old barn, a door he'd patched with corrugated iron after the 38 storm. He'd loaded his Winchester with a custom shell, lead pellets mixed with coarse iron filings packed tight behind a cardboard wad, and fired from 20 paces. The door hadn't just dented, it had shattered, the filings embedding like shrapnel into the wood behind it. The physics were crude but undeniable. At close range, the shotgun's spread wasn't a weakness. It was a distributed impact field. And when combined with the right payload, it turned thin metal into a death trap for whatever lay behind it. "Croft," whispered Sergeant Mallory, crouched beside him, eyes fixed on the road. "If that Panzer turns this way, we're dead. You got any tricks in that pea-shooter?" Tommy didn't answer. He was watching the tank's side again, the way the skirt rippled as the suspension compressed over uneven ground. He remembered the barn door, the way the iron filings had torn through the rust like paper. "I might," he said quietly. Mallory snorted. "Christ. You're going to shoot a tank with a bloody shotgun?" "No," Tommy said. "I'm going to shoot its skin." The tank didn't turn. It rumbled past, its commander scanning the hedgerows with binoculars, oblivious to the man in the ditch who'd just seen not a fortress on treads, but a machine with seams, joints, and vulnerabilities no engineer in Berlin had bothered to armor. 3 days later, during a lull in the fighting near Carentan, Tommy found himself in a requisitioned farmhouse cellar with a dented ammo crate, a roll of waxed paper, and a half-pound of scrap iron he'd pried from a downed Storch reconnaissance plane. He worked in silence, rolling cartridges by candlelight, packing each shell with a blend of buckshot and iron grit in precise ratios he'd tested back home. 3 parts lead, 1 part filing, sealed with a cork wad soaked in linseed oil to prevent moisture absorption. The other men watched him with a mix of pity and amusement. "Farmer Croft's magic beans," one joked. "Gonna grow a beanstalk up Hitler's arse." But Tommy didn't care. He'd seen what happened when thin steel met dispersed kinetic energy at close range. He'd seen the barn door explode inward, the filings tearing through the wooden beams behind it like hot needles through butter. If a Panzer's side skirt was no thicker than that door, and he was certain it wasn't, Then his shells might not stop the tank, but they could blind its crew, rupture its fuel lines, or worse, send a storm of secondary fragmentation into the fighting compartment. He tested his first modified shell on a captured CKFZ 251 half-track abandoned in a wheat field. From 15 meters he fired. The buckshot and filings struck the vehicle's thin side plating with a sound like hail on a tin roof, then silence. But when he approached, he saw it. The interior lining shredded, the radio unit riddled with pinprick holes, the driver's seat soaked in oil that had leaked from a punctured reservoir. The shell hadn't penetrated the armor in the traditional sense. It had transmitted its energy through it. Excited, Tommy reported his findings to Lieutenant Hargrove, the company's ordnance liaison. The officer, a Cambridge-educated engineer with a neatly trimmed mustache and a disdain for barnyard ballistics, barely glanced at the half-track before waving him off. "Private, shotguns are for clearing trenches, not engaging armor. What you've demonstrated is localized spalling. Interesting perhaps, but tactically irrelevant. The Wehrmacht doesn't fight from half-tracks. They fight from Panthers and Tigers, with frontal armor thicker than your entire torso." "But sir," Tommy pressed, "what if we get close? In urban fighting, in the bocage, their side armor on the Panther is only 45 millimeters, and that's just the hull. The skirts, the vision ports, the exhaust grills, they're all thin. If we can hit those at under 20 meters..." Hargrove sighed, tapping his cigarette ash into a tin cup. "Croft, I appreciate rural ingenuity, but war isn't won by fox-scaring tricks. Stick to your lane, and for God's sake, stop wasting buckshot on scrap metal." That night, Tommy returned to the cellar. He didn't argue, he didn't appeal. He simply made more shells, 20 of them, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked into a spare bandolier. He knew the army wouldn't listen. Institutions never did, until they had no choice. The chance came sooner than he expected. On June 18th, during the chaotic street fighting in St. Lo, Tommy S. platoon was pinned down in a collapsed bakery by a lone Panther that had broken through the American lines. Its main gun had already reduced 2 Sherman tanks to burning hulks, and its machine guns stitched the rubble with lethal precision. Retreat meant crossing open ground under fire. Advance meant death. But Tommy saw something the others missed. The Panther was backing into a narrow alley, its rear fender scraping against a stone wall. Its engine roared in reverse, struggling to turn. And its left side skirt, exposed, vibrating with every gear shift, was no more than 3 millimeters thick. Without orders, Tommy slithered through the rubble, his Winchester held low. He moved like a man used to stalking game at dawn, silent, deliberate, eyes fixed on the gap between the tank and the wall. At 12 meters he rose, braced against a shattered oven, and fired. The blast was swallowed by the roar of the Panther's engine, but the effect was immediate. The side skirt buckled inward with a sharp crack, and from inside the tank came a muffled scream. Then silence. The Panther lurched forward, then stalled. Smoke curled from its vision slits. Moments later, the hatch popped open, and 2 crewmen tumbled out, clutching their faces, blood streaming between their fingers. Tommy didn't know it yet, but the iron filings had punched through the thin steel, ricocheted inside the cramped turret, and shredded the optic lenses, the radio faceplate, and the left eye of the gunner. The tank wasn't destroyed, but it was blind, deaf, and bleeding. As American infantry swarmed the immobilized Panther, Lieutenant Hargrove found Tommy reloading behind a flour-smeared counter. "What the hell did you do?" the officer asked, voice tight with disbelief. Tommy ejected the spent shell. "Shot its skin, sir." Hargrove stared at the smoking tank, then at the farmer-turned-paratrooper, his earlier certainty crumbling like the bakery walls around them. "Show me how you made those shells," he said quietly. And so, in the ruins of St. Lo, with the smell of burnt bread and diesel thick in the air, the first official test of what would later be codenamed Buckstorm began. Not in a laboratory, not in a boardroom, but in the hands of a man who knew more about soil than steel, yet understood both in the language of force and fracture. The rain began just after midnight on June 20th, 1944. Falling in cold, steady sheets that turned the Normandy fields into shallow lakes and the roads into rivers of mud. Inside a requisitioned cider barn, outside Perrier, Tommy Croft stood before a long trestle table lit by 3 kerosene lanterns, their flames flickering against the damp stone walls. Around him, a dozen ordnance technicians and 2 skeptical captains from the Ordnance Corps watched as he laid out his materials. Waxed paper cartridges, lead pellets sorted by diameter, iron filings sieved through a flour sifter, cork wads, linseed oil, and a modified Winchester Model 12 with its choke removed to maximize spread. "You're telling us," said Captain Rennick, arms crossed, voice edged with academic impatience, "that by mixing farm scrap with buckshot, you've created an anti-armor round that can disable a Panther at close range." "I'm not saying it disables the armor," Tommy replied, his voice calm, hands steady as he rolled a fresh shell. "I'm saying it disables what's behind the armor. The crew, the optics, the fuel lines. Thin steel doesn't stop energy, it transmits it. Like a drumhead." Rennick exchanged a glance with his colleague. "That's not ballistics. That's folklore." "Maybe," Tommy said, sealing the shell with a twist of twine. "But folklore wins wars when science runs out of answers." He loaded the shotgun and stepped to the far end of the barn, where a salvaged Panther side skirt, still bolted to a section of hull, had been mounted on a wooden frame. At 15 meters, he fired. The report echoed off the rafters, followed by the sharp ping of metal striking metal. When the smoke cleared, the technicians moved forward, flashlights in hand. The outer steel showed only shallow dents, but when they peeled back the inner lining, they found a nightmare of embedded fragments, lead and iron fused together in a starburst pattern, some pieces driven deep into the wooden backing. One fragment had pierced a mock radio casing placed behind the armor. Another had shredded a leather glove representing a crewman's hand. "Jesus," muttered one technician. "It's like the shell turned the armor into a shotgun itself." "Exactly," Tommy thought, but said nothing. Over the next 48 hours, under Rennick's reluctant supervision, they conducted a series of controlled tests. They fired standard buckshot, minimal effect. They fired pure iron filings, too dispersed, low penetration. But the hybrid load, 3 parts to 100 buck, 1 part coarse iron grit, packed behind a linseed-soaked wad, consistently produced what they began calling transmitted fragmentation, energy that passed through thin steel and erupted inward with lethal efficiency. By June 22nd, a preliminary report was drafted and couriered to SHAEF headquarters in Portsmouth. It was dismissed as anecdotal and tactically marginal, but fate intervened in the form of Colonel Elias Voss, a former metallurgist turned logistics officer who had once studied vibration-induced fatigue in aircraft skins. He read Tommy's report not as a weapons proposal, but as a material science anomaly, and he recognized the principle immediately: impulse dispersion through resonant surfaces. Voss arrived in Perrier on June 24th, unannounced, wearing a rain-slicked trench coat and carrying a briefcase full of German technical manuals. He didn't ask Tommy to demonstrate. He asked him to explain. "Why iron filings?" Voss asked, sitting across from him in the barn's hayloft, steam rising from their tin mugs of ersatz coffee. "Because iron's dense," Tommy said. "Lead deforms on impact. Iron stays sharp. And when it hits thin steel at close range, it doesn't just punch holes, it makes the whole plate vibrate, like hitting a bell. And inside a tank, that bell rings with shrapnel." Voss nodded slowly. "You've weaponized resonance." "I just wanted to scare foxes off my chickens," Tommy said with a faint smile. Voss didn't smile back. "Foxes don't wear steel skirts, but Panthers do. And we're losing men every day because our bazookas can't get close enough in the bocage." He stood, brushing hay from his coat. "We're going to test this in combat, not as an experiment, as a tactic." The opportunity came during Operation Cobra, the breakout from St. Lo in late July. The 2nd Armored Division, spearheading the advance, encountered fierce resistance near Coutances, where German panzer units used the dense hedgerows to ambush American columns. Standard anti-tank teams struggled. The bazooka required a clear line of sight, and the narrow lanes offered none. But paratroopers and infantry, trained in close-quarters hedgerow fighting, could get within 20 meters unseen. On July 27th, near the village of Canisi, a mixed platoon of 82nd Airborne and 4th Infantry soldiers was ambushed by 2 Panther tanks concealed behind a stone wall. As Shermans burned in the road, Tommy, now unofficially attached to the unit as a close assault advisor, led a 4-man team through a drainage ditch. Each man carried a modified Winchester and 10 Buckstorm shells. At 18 meters, they rose as one. 4 shotguns roared in unison. The Panthers didn't explode. They didn't even catch fire. But within seconds, both hatches flew open. Crewmen stumbled out, blinded by shattered optics, ears bleeding from the concussive ring of their own hulls. One tank's engine sputtered and died, the fuel line severed by a fragment that had passed through the side skirt like a ghost. American infantry swarmed the vehicles. No American lives were lost in the engagement. Word spread faster than orders. By August, every airborne and ranger unit in Normandy was requesting Croft loads. Field workshops in Cherbourg and Rennes began mass-producing the shells using scrap from downed aircraft and destroyed vehicles. The recipe was simple: 100 buckshot, iron filings from shredded engine blocks, linseed wads from captured German supply caches. Even the shotguns were repurposed. Winchesters, Remington 870s, even British-made Holland & Hollands pressed into service, but the War Department remained unconvinced. In Washington, a panel of ballistics experts declared the effect statistically insignificant and not reproducible under controlled conditions. One general reportedly quipped, "Next, they'll be throwing pitchforks at tigers." Then came the Battle of the Bulge. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, in December 1944, American forces were caught off guard by Hitler's last great offensive. Panzer divisions rolled through the snow, overrunning outposts and supply depots. In the town of Bastogne, surrounded and freezing, the 101st Airborne held the line with dwindling ammunition and no heavy weapons, but they had shotguns and they had Buckstorm shells. On December 22nd, during a pre-dawn German assault on the western perimeter, a platoon of paratroopers, led by Sergeant Mike Driscoll, used the cover of a snowstorm to approach a Jagdpanzer IV concealed in a barn. From 12 meters, they fired 6 shotgun rounds into the vehicle's thin rear armor. The effect was catastrophic. The iron filings pierced the engine compartment, igniting fuel vapors. The lead pellets shattered the crew's vision blocks. One fragment severed the radio antenna at its base, cutting off communication. The Jagdpanzer never fired a shot. It burned quietly in the snow, its crew dead before they could react. By Christmas Eve, Bastogne's defenders had disabled 7 armored vehicles using nothing but shotguns and homemade shells. The tactic became known as ghosting, silent, close-range strikes that left tanks intact but inoperable. Their crews dead or maimed without a single shell fired in return. Back in London, Colonel Voss compiled the in-engagements under 20 meters. Units using Buckstorm shells achieved a 92% mission kill rate against light and medium German armor. 0 American casualties in those specific actions. He sent the report directly to General Eisenhower's office with a single handwritten note. The farmer was right. This time, the response was immediate. On January 3, 1945, SHAEF issued Field Order 114A. All infantry and airborne units operating in close terrain are authorized to employ modified shotgun munitions against enemy light armor, vision ports, and external components. Production of Type C fragmentation shells is hereby prioritized at all forward ordnance depots. Tommy Croft, still a private, was summoned to a briefing in Versailles. He expected a reprimand for unauthorized weapons development. Instead, he found a room full of generals, scientists, and journalists. A colonel handed him a citation. "You've changed how we fight in cities, forests, and hedgerows," he said. "You've given the infantry a weapon that costs pennies and kills tanks." Tommy looked at the paper, then at the faces around him. Men who had once called his idea ridiculous. "I didn't change anything," he said quietly. "I just remembered what thin metal sounds like when it breaks." The winter of 1945 settled over the Rhineland like a shroud, the air so cold it crystallized breath into silver plumes and turned tank treads brittle as old bone. In a snow-dusted orchard outside Aachen, Tommy Croft stood beside a captured Panther, its black cross half buried in frost, its barrel pointing uselessly at the sky. He wasn't here as a soldier anymore. He was here as a ghost, the quiet architect of a revolution no one had seen coming, yet everyone now used. Around him, a dozen German prisoners, hands bound, watched with hollow eyes as American engineers dismantled the tank, measuring the pockmarks on its side skirts, cataloguing the internal damage caused by shotgun-fired iron filings. One of the prisoners, a young Panzer radio operator with a bandage over his left eye, spoke in halting English. You shot us with hunting guns?" Tommy nodded. "Fox guns," the German laughed bitterly. "We trained for Shermans, for bazookas, for airstrikes, not farmers with shotguns." "That's the point," Tommy said. "You armored against what you feared. We attacked what you ignored. The truth was spreading faster than any bullet. In urban combat across Germany, Aachen, Cologne, Frankfurt, American infantry units were bypassing heavy anti-tank protocols altogether. Instead of waiting for tank support or calling in artillery, small teams armed with modified shotguns would infiltrate ruined buildings, crawl through rubble-choked alleys, and strike at point-blank range. Their targets weren't the thick frontal plates of tigers or panthers, but the fragile ecosystems that kept those machines alive: vision blocks, periscopes, exhaust grills, fuel caps, and the thin steel skirts meant only to stop magnetic mines. Each Buckstorm shell cost less than 50 cents to produce. Each engagement lasted seconds, and each success eroded the myth of German armored invincibility, one shattered optic at a time. But the real test came not in cities, but in the open. Fields beyond the Rhine, where the Wehrmacht, desperate and dwindling, deployed its last reserve, the Jagdtiger, a 70-ton behemoth mounting a 128mm gun, its frontal armor nearly 250mm thick. Conventional wisdom said it was impervious. Even the new 90mm guns on the M36 tank destroyer struggled to penetrate it at range. Yet on March 17th, near the town of Unna, a patrol from the 9th Armored Division encountered a Jagdtiger stalled on a bridge, its engine smoking from mechanical failure. It couldn't move, but it could still kill. A Sherman fired first. Its 76mm shell ricocheted off the Jagdtiger's glacis like a pebble. A second Sherman was destroyed by the return shot. Panic set in. Then Private First Class Luis Mendez, former Texas ranch hand and shotgun enthusiast, remembered the rumors from Bastogne. He'd brought his grandfather's Ithaca 37 with him, loaded with Buckstorm shells, scavenged from a supply depot in Liège. Ignoring orders to fall back, Mendez sprinted through the smoke, using the cover of a burning half-track. At 10 meters, he fired into the Jagdtiger's rear engine grille, a thin louvered panel designed for ventilation, not combat. The shell didn't penetrate the main armor. It didn't need to. The iron filings tore through the radiator fins, shredded the fan belt, and ignited pooled diesel in the engine compartment. Within minutes, the Jagdtiger was engulfed in flames, its crew bailing out into the icy river below. When the after-action report reached Schaff, it included a single line that would echo through military academies for decades. the most heavily armored vehicle in the world, was disabled by a $25 shotgun and a shell made from scrap. Production of Buckstorm shells surged. By April 1945, over 200,000 had been distributed across the European theatre. Factories in Detroit and Birmingham retooled assembly lines to produce standardized Make-I Croft loads, complete with waterproof casings and pre-measured iron-lead blends. Even the British took notice. SOE operatives in occupied Norway began using similar rounds to disable German coastal patrol boats, targeting their thin hulls below the waterline. But Tommy saw none of it. He'd been quietly reassigned to a training cadre in Nancy, tasked with teaching close assault tactics to new recruits. He demonstrated the technique without fanfare, loading shells with the same care he once used to fill seed bags. "Remember," he told a group of wide-eyed privates one rainy afternoon, "you're not fighting the tank. You're fighting the idea that it's invincible, and ideas break easier than steel." Meanwhile, in Washington, the War Department scrambled to retroactively justify what had already happened. A classified study, Project Barn Door, concluded that non-penetrating kinetic munitions could achieve mission kills against 78% of Axis armored vehicles through secondary effects alone. The report recommended immediate adoption of similar principles for future infantry anti-armor systems, but bureaucracy moved slowly. By the time the study was declassified in 1951, the war was over, and Tommy Croft had returned to Norfolk, to his barley fields and his foxes. He never filed a patent, never sought a medal. When a journalist from Life magazine tracked him down in 1946, he refused to be photographed. "The war's done," he said. "Let the dead keep their secrets." Yet his legacy lived on, in the alleys of Seoul during the Korean War, where Marines used shotgun rounds to disable T-34s, in the jungles of Vietnam, where Green Berets modified shells to breach Viet Cong bunkers, and in the deserts of Iraq, where special forces used similar principles to disable technicals and light armor without triggering catastrophic explosions. But in the winter of 1945, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the next bridge, the next tank, the next fox in the chicken coop, and the quiet understanding that sometimes the most powerful weapons aren't forged in steel mills, but in the minds of those who see the world, not as it is armored, but as it is vulnerable. Spring came late to the Ruhr in 1945, the thaw revealing not blossoms, but bones, shattered panzers half submerged in mud, their turrets askew like broken teeth, the skeletal remains of factories stripped bare by bombing, and the silent snow-dusted fields where men had died, not by grand strategy, but by inches, by seconds, by the sudden intimate violence of a shotgun blast at 10 paces. In a commandeered schoolhouse near Dortmund, now serving as a temporary ordnance evaluation center, Tommy Croft sat at a scarred oak desk, his hands stained with gunpowder and linseed oil, reviewing field reports from the final weeks of the war. The numbers told a story no general had foreseen. Between January and May 1945, Allied infantry units using Buckstorm shells had disabled or mission-killed 312 German armored vehicles, mostly Panthers, Stooges and half-tracks, without a single recorded loss in those specific engagements. The average engagement distance, 14.3 meters. The average time from first shot to crew evacuation, 8.7 seconds. Most critically, the psychological impact was immeasurable. German tank crews, once confident in their steel cocoons, now feared every alley, every hedgerow, every shadow. Diaries recovered from captured vehicles spoke of ghost shots and invisible hunters. One panzer commander wrote, "They do not fight like soldiers. They fight like farmers killing rats." Tommy folded the report and placed it in a manila envelope marked "Eyes Only, Voss." He didn't feel pride. He felt exhaustion and a strange, quiet sorrow. He had not set out to invent a weapon. He had set out to protect his chickens, and yet his solution had become a scalpel in the hands of men who carved through the myth of invincibility, one thin plate at a time. Colonel Voss arrived that evening, his uniform crisp despite the mud-streaked jeep that brought him. He carried a bottle of Calvados and 2 tin cups. "They're calling it the Croft Doctrine now," he said, pouring a generous measure. "Infantry Close Assault Doctrine, Section 7B. It'll be in the field manuals by 46. Tommy sipped the apple brandy, its warmth cutting through the damp chill. "I didn't write a doctrine. I just noticed that thin metal rings when you hit it right." Voss smiled faintly. "That's the problem with institutions, Tommy. They need names for things they don't understand. They call it doctrine, so they don't have to admit it came from a farmer." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the distant rumble of convoys moving east. Finally, Voss leaned forward. "There's something else." "The Pacific," Tommy looked up. "The Marines are fighting in Okinawa. Japanese tanks are lighter, Type 95 Hagos mostly, but they're dug in, hull down, in caves and coral ridges. Bazookas can't get a clean shot. Flamethrowers run out of fuel. But shotguns can be fired around corners, into slits, down ventilation shafts." He slid a photograph across the desk. It showed a Marine, face streaked with soot, holding a sawed-off shotgun beside a smouldering Japanese tank. The turret hatch was open. Inside, the crew lay motionless. "They've started making their own versions," Voss said, "using sand and crushed coral mixed with buckshot. It's crude, but it works. They call it reef-load." Tommy studied the photo. The Marine looked no older than he was. 23, maybe 24. A boy with a farmer's tool, fighting a war he never asked for. "Tell them to use iron if they can," Tommy said quietly. "Sand erodes barrels. Iron sings." Voss nodded, tucking the photo away. "I'll pass it on." He paused, then added, "You could stay, you know. The army wants you to head a new R&D cell, close-quarters munitions. They'll make you a captain, maybe major." Tommy shook his head. "I'm not a soldier. I'm a man who got lost and found a way to make noise." Voss didn't argue. He knew better. 2 weeks later, as the last pockets of German resistance collapsed, Tommy boarded a troop ship bound for Southampton. He carried no commendations, no medals, no official recognition beyond a faded discharge, paper and a duffel bag containing his Winchester, now worn smooth from use. Back in Wymondham, the barley fields were greening again. The foxes had returned, and the old barn door, the one he'd shot in 1942, still hung crooked on its hinges, riddled with holes that let in the spring rain. He never spoke of the war. Not to neighbours, not to reporters, not even to his younger brother, who'd served in the Royal Navy. When asked what he did during the war, he'd simply say, "I fixed radios." But late at night, when the wind blew from the east, he'd sometimes walk to the edge of his property, load his Winchester with standard buckshot, and fire into a rusted oil drum he'd set up near the hedgerow. Not to practice, not to remember, just to hear the sound thin metal makes when it breaks. The rain that fell over Norfolk on the morning of November 3rd, 1945, was the kind that didn't so much fall as seep, a slow, grey saturation that blurred the line between earth and sky, turning hedgerows into ink smudges and barley stubble into drowned parchment. Ellis Tommy Croft stood at the edge of his eastern field, hands buried in the pockets of a D-mob coat 2 sizes too large, watching steam rise from the flanks of his Shire mare as she pulled a rusted harrow through the fallow soil. He hadn't fired a shotgun in months, hadn't even touched his Winchester since the day he'd handed it over to a quartermaster in Southampton, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine like a parcel meant for someone else. Yet the weight of it still lived in his shoulder, a phantom ache that surfaced whenever silence stretched too long or the wind carried the metallic tang of wet iron. He was home, yes, but home no longer felt like a place. It felt like an echo. The war had ended in Europe in May, in Asia in August, but for men like Tommy, peace wasn't a date on a calendar. It was a slow unraveling of nerves, a recalibration of senses, trained to detect the whisper of a tank's suspension over gravel, the glint of a periscope in tall grass, the particular silence that preceded an ambush. Back in Wymondham, neighbours spoke of rationing and reconstruction, of Churchill's fall and Attlee's rise, of American jeeps still parked in village squares like relics from a dream. But none of them asked what it was like to stand 12 meters from a Panther and pull a trigger, knowing your only armor was faith in physics and fox-scaring grit. And Tommy never offered. He plowed. He mended fences. He attended Sunday service and nodded politely at the vicar's sermons about redemption and sacrifice. But at night, when the house creaked with the memory of wind and the barn door, still riddled with buckshot holes from 1942, groaned on its hinges, he would lie awake listening not to owls or distant trains, but to the ghost of a sound, the sharp, wet crack of thin steel giving way under dispersed kinetic force. It was a sound no one else had ever truly heard, not the generals in their map rooms, not the ballistics experts with their wind tunnels and high-speed cameras, not even the men who'd fired his shells in the bocage and lived to tell of it. They'd seen the results. But only Tommy had listened to the moment armor ceased to protect and began to betray. He didn't know it then, but that sound, the resonance of vulnerability, would echo far beyond Normandy, beyond even the war itself. In the spring of 1946, a quiet delegation from the U.S. Army Ordnance Corps arrived at his farm under the guise of agricultural surveyors. They wore civilian suits, but carried themselves like men accustomed to salutes. Their leader, a lean major with a West Point ring and a limp from Bastogne, introduced himself as Major Karl Renner, no relation to the skeptical Captain Rennick from Perrier, though the irony wasn't lost on Tommy. Over tea in the farmhouse kitchen, Renner laid out a proposal. The Army wanted to formalize the Croft load as a standard close assault munition. They were prepared to offer a patent, a consultancy role, even a commission. Tommy stirred his tea, watching the spoon clink against the chipped porcelain. "I didn't invent anything," he said. "I just noticed that thin metal rings when you hit it right." Renner leaned forward. "Sir, you gave infantrymen a way to kill tanks without dying themselves. That's not observation. That's salvation." Tommy looked out the window at his mare, now grazing near the old barn. "Salvation's a church word. What I did was practical. Like fixing a leaky roof or grafting apple branches. You don't patent that. You just do it." Renner left that afternoon with nothing but a jar of homemade blackberry jam and a handshake. The patent was never filed. The commission never offered. And Tommy Croft faded from official memory as quickly as he'd emerged. Another anonymous cog in the vast machinery of total war. But the idea refused to die. By 1948, British commandos training in the Scottish Highlands were experimenting with Croft-style loads for bunker clearance in Malaya. In Korea, U.S. Marines, facing T-3485s in the narrow streets of Seoul, began modifying 12-gauge shells with crushed granite and lead slugs, achieving similar results against the Soviet-made tanks' thin side armor and vision blocks. A declassified Marine Corps after-action report from November 1950 noted, "Enemy crews often abandoned vehicles intact after shotgun strikes to periscopes and engine grills, believing internal explosion imminent. Psychological effect exceeded physical damage. The principle had metastasized. It wasn't about destroying the machine. It was about convincing the men inside that their sanctuary had become a tomb." Back in Norfolk, Tommy read none of these reports. He had no interest in legacy. He planted winter wheat that October, the same variety his grandfather had sown in 1902. He repaired the stone wall along the western boundary, one lichen-crusted block at a time. And when foxes returned to the chicken coop in 49, he loaded his old double-barrel, not the Winchester which he'd never reclaimed, and fired 2 rounds into the night. The foxes fled. The chickens survived. And for the first time since 1944, Tommy felt he'd used a weapon for its true purpose. Protection, not destruction. Yet history has a way of circling back. In 1953, Colonel Elias Voss, now retired and living in Sussex, wrote a letter. Not to the War Office, not to a publisher, but to Tommy himself. In it, he enclosed a grainy photograph taken in a ruined factory outside Dusseldorf in April 1945. It showed a group of American soldiers standing beside a disabled Panther. One of them held a Winchester shotgun. Scrawled on the back in Voss's precise hand, they called it magic. We knew it was physics. You knew it was farming. Tommy tucked the photo into the back of his Bible, between Psalms and Proverbs, and never spoke of it again. Decades passed. The Cold War froze and thawed. Men who'd fought in the Bocage grew old, then died. The Winchester Model 12 was replaced by semi-autos, then by modular combat shotguns with Picatinny rails and laser sights. Yet in every conflict where infantry faced armored vehicles in confined spaces, the jungles of Vietnam, the alleys of Beirut, the mountains of Chechnya, the same improvisation resurfaced, soldiers loading shotguns with nails, ball bearings, even broken glass, hoping to exploit the same vulnerability Tommy had seen in a vibrating tank skirt near Sainte-Mère-Église. The military finally caught up in 1989. During the Gulf War, U.S. Special Forces operating behind Iraqi lines developed the M1030 canister round, a 12-gauge shell packed with tungsten pellets designed to disable light armor, sensors and optics at under 30 meters. Its technical brief cited non-penetrating kinetic disruption as its core principle. Buried in footnote 12, Conceptual Precedent Croft Load ETO 1944. Tommy never saw it. He died on a clear October morning in 1987, sitting on his porch with a mug of tea, watching swallows gather on the telephone wire before their migration south. The local paper ran a brief obituary. Ellis Croft, 66, farmer and WWII veteran, passed peacefully at home. No mention of shotguns. No mention of tanks. Just a man who came back and stayed, but his silence was louder than any medal. In 2003, during the invasion of Iraq, a team from the U.S. Army Research Laboratory, studying urban combat in Fallujah, recovered a disabled T-72 that had been immobilized not by a javelin missile or a tank round, but by repeated shotgun blasts to its driver's viewport and engine louvers. Inside, they found fragments of lead and iron embedded in the control panel, identical in composition to samples from Normandy. The Iraqi crew had bailed out, convinced the vehicle was about to explode. It never did. But it never moved again. The lead engineer on the project, Dr. Lena Cho, later wrote in her journal, "We keep reinventing Croft's insight, that armor is only as strong as its weakest resonance. The rest is noise. Today, the original Buckstorm shell resides in a climate-controlled case at the U.S. Army Ordnance Museum in Fort Lee, Virginia. Beside it, a placard reads, Prototype Anti-Armor Shotgun Round, developed by PVT Ellis Croft, 82nd Airborne Division, 1944. Enabled infantry to neutralize light and medium-armored vehicles in close terrain. Estimated impact, 300-plus enemy vehicles disabled, hundreds of Allied lives saved. No fanfare, no dramatic lighting, just glass, steel, and silence, and perhaps that's fitting, because Tommy Croft never sought glory. He sought understanding. He saw what others dismissed, a vibration, a flex, a flaw in the logic of invincibility, and he trusted his eyes over doctrine. In a war defined by scale, 1,000 bomber raids, million-man armies, continent-spanning logistics, he proved that sometimes the tide turns not with a thunderclap, but with the soft, lethal whisper of iron filings passing through thin steel. His story endures not in monuments, but in moments. In the split second, a soldier chooses to step forward instead of back. In the quiet calculation that vulnerability is not the absence of armor, but the presence of attention, and in the end, that is the most dangerous weapon of all, not the one that breaks steel, but the one that sees it can be broken. The barley still grows in Wymondham. The barn door still hangs crooked. And if you stand very still on a damp November morning, With the wind blowing east from the sea, you might just hear it, the faint, ringing echo of a truth first spoken by a farmer with a shotgun and a fox to scare. Even the hardest shells have seams.